Welcome, everyone, to our webinar today on lessons from private equity for federal government on uh, cutting contracting spending, but most importantly, creating efficiencies while strengthening the vendor base. We know it's a really important topic, lots going on right now, and probably more changes than we've ever seen in this shorter period. So we're excited to convene this panel today. And rather than me doing the introductions, I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves. And I'm Raj Sharma. I'm the CEO and founder of Public Spend Forum, and I'll be moderating today. Simon?
Good afternoon from where I am. Good morning to where I think you guys are. So my name's Simon. I'm the vice president in a company called Efficio, which is a procurement supply chain consultancy. Delighted to be part of this event today. I will caveat everything for those who can pick up from the accent. Most of my experience and most of the things I'll be talking to today will be in relation to UK and European public sector.
Great. Alan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Alan Thomas. I'm the founder of Alpha Tango Strategies, which does growth strategies focused on U.S. federal market. And I am the former commissioner of the Federal Acquisition Service at the U.S. General Services Administration. I served in that role in the first Trump administration back from 2017 to 2019. Glad to be here.
Great. Thank you. And Matt?
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Lextutis. I'm director with Efficio, focusing on private equity and also some work in the public sector here in North America. My background is across public sector, having worked within the defense sector quite heavily, particularly in shipbuilding and at the intersection of private equity. So excited to get into this discussion today. Thanks, Raj.
Great, thank you. So in terms of agenda today, we only have a short 30 minutes, so now down to 27 minutes. And so I'll just do a very quick run through a paper we released. We'll put the link down in case you don't have it. And then after that, jump into a panel discussion because that's most important. And then if people would like to stick around, we will past 11:30. Just invite people up and just have a discussion, which is always great because I know some of the people joining, we've got some very senior people joining and lots of great experience across the board. So if anyone would like to stay on beyond 11:30, that would be great. So let me go ahead and just share my screen for just a couple of minutes and then I'll come back to the panel discussion. So I'm going to go to just the paper here. So if you have not seen the paper again, we'll put the link up right now. So 5 strategies. Now this 5 strategies, we worked on this a bit. Now this is a combination of looking at private equity, but also then our experience in government, whether it's US, UK, Europe. So looking at what others are doing. So we really tried to capture this in a short, concise way. Now, there might be a lot more than 5 strategies, we understand, but we wanted to make this really, really short and actionable, most importantly. So really the 5 strategies here, again, I'm not going to go through these in detail, and we'll chime in as we talk. But number 1 is smarter contracting, we're calling it disaggregation. And renegotiation. We believe that this is a really significant opportunity, both renegotiation in terms of specifically looking at contracts, whether it's pass-through rates, and also disaggregation, because a lot of government contracts are really bundled into these very large contracts that where there might be barriers for smaller businesses. So we believe there's inefficiency both. As well as ability to bring in companies that have niche capabilities and have direct access to them. So we talk about that in the paper. Second is avoiding the gold rush in September. Now, we know I've been a part of it. That's always a boon, but we think it helps everyone, companies and government, if there's better planning and more incentives to spend better. So we think over the long term, everyone benefits from this, both industry and government. So that's number 2. Number 3 is centralized purchasing. Now, this is already going on. We already know there's a number of things going on. GSA centralization there from a number of civilian agencies, some other things going on in defense as well. So This is definitely an important area, and one thing we just recommend in here is that there's accountability to those placed on the organizations where we're centralizing, because we know that's been an issue in the past. Number 4 is renegotiating services, contracts, labor rates. Now, again, this is both good for industry and government because sometimes the business models are not understood. We talk about that in this paper, and there's an opportunity to do this better. And again, we believe creates less headaches and creates efficiency and better outcomes at the end of the day. And then the very last is smarter budgeting. Now, some of this is also going on. Zero-based budgeting, starting from scratch. So questioning every time we have a contract renewal, et cetera, coming up. So these are, again, 5 strategies in each one. We go through, talk about each one, and we have specifics here in terms of private equity and then some recommendations. So we would encourage you to take a look. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and jump into our discussion because I know there's so much richness, and having only 22 minutes to do this discussion won't do it justice. But let me just go ahead and jump in. So Simon and Matt, you helped author this paper along with us. What is one strategy in private equity across your work that you see that can rapidly start to drive cost savings and efficiency and really benefit all?
Yeah, I would focus in on the conversation around services, right? I think this is one of the areas where we repeatedly see opportunity when we're working with private equity, regardless of the kind of entity that we're working with. Sometimes they're industrial companies supporting defense, sometimes they're purely commercial, right? But fairly consistently, when we look at services, what we see is that way too often it is oriented towards input measures, right, as opposed to outcome-based measures, right? And this is where the private equity lens really comes to bear because they're focused in on value, right? It's not just about getting me the lowest rate on something. They want an outcome that's going to raise the profitability or the impact to their customers, right? So for example, a lot of the contracts that we will see when we walk into an organization with PE are purely hour-based, right? So these companies are contracting a vast majority of their services on labor hours. We flip that on its head, right? And we turn it into a conversation around KPIs and around the outcomes that you're really after, right? So this could be in IT services, it could be around facilities management and the broad range. But I would say every time we get engaged, we look there. It's a place that always yields benefit. And that's the way we engage with PE because they want us in and they want us out and they want an outcome. And so they look to us to do the same thing.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Simon, would you like to add? And then Alan, I know, has many perspectives.
Yeah, Raj, from a UK government perspective, I completely agree with Matt. We see that all the time. And I think I would only add that sometimes it's not even necessarily about renegotiating these contracts. There's huge opportunity to get better value from existing contracts. It's very rare that we see public sector organizations actually testing what some of the professional services providers are delivering within those contracts. A huge opportunity there. And I think our other perspective, the difference between my experience in public sector and private equity is public sector often looks at procurement as a process and a risk mitigation task, right? And private equity looks at it as an opportunity to increase value. And we're constantly encouraging our public sector customers to move more to that, looking at the value of procurement as a skill set.
Great. No, those are great. And definitely, I think quickly getting in, getting out, showing the value, that's really critical. Alan, you have really, you just mentioned you've been FAS commissioner. You've worked in private equity yourself. You were in a .com. You and I worked together a long time ago. So you bring really all perspectives. So what are you talking to your clients about and recommending?
Well, Raj, this topic is really interesting, right? Because, the role that I had in the first Trump administration, the person that's filling that role today in the second Trump administration comes from the world of private equity, right? And somebody who's done a lot of corporate restructuring work in his career. So it's really bringing that kind of perspective to federal procurement writ large. So the topic is great and very timely, and I think we've seen a number of actions play out that you would sort of traditionally find when someone goes in and takes over, what I think some people would consider a distressed asset. Hey, the federal government's spending way more money than it takes in, right? So if you just look at it from that perspective, you might say, wait, this is a distressed asset. We need to do things differently. Procurement, to Matt's point, procurement is one area, obviously, where the administration and the DOGE team or the U.S. Department of Government Efficiency has really focused in on. And in fact, I just read an article today, right, talking about how they're going to focus in on outcome-based contracts, which is something that Matt mentioned, right? And I'll put the link in the chat when I'm done yapping here, so people can take a look at that article. But outcome-based contracts, trying to negotiate kind of flat labor rates that apply across the board for the government, right? Capping indirect rates, a number of things I think that you might see in sort of a classic PE restructure play, right? Or from a procurement standpoint, are coming to the fore here. So fascinating time to be involved in government procurement. And on top of all that, there's a big rewrite of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, which, to Simon's point about, hey, government's process, they sort of think of procurement as process and rules. They're rewriting, rethinking all those processes and rules that that govern how the federal government buys things. So an incredible amount of change happening in a really, really short window.
Yeah, it's both exciting and nerve-wracking. And I know from a standpoint of, we have a few people here joining from industry or advise industry too. We know it's also created really uncertain times and uncertainty, and again, a lot of changes on the contractor side. So with that, my next question is really about that. So we talk about efficiency, cost savings, and we can drill into that a little bit more, come back to that. But do you believe that we can, at the same time, we argue that, we can also strengthen the industrial base, which is a really key objective right now. The industrial base has atrophied over time. Are we getting the right contractors in? Are we getting enough commercial firms in? So I'd love to get your perspectives on how can we strengthen the industrial base and also help bring in, I believe, in my own personal experience, bring in more smaller companies and create opportunities for small businesses.
You want me to take that one to start, Raj?
Sure. Why don't you start, and then Matt and Simon would love to hear your perspective on it.
Yeah, I think we've seen, this administration, right? They put an executive order out on buying commercial solutions and generally trying to buy much more like a commercial entity. And there are a number of techniques at the federal level to do that, right? Things like the commercial solution opening procurement technique, or using, the other transaction authority that we've seen. I think you're going to see more of that from this administration. And one of the reasons they're doing that is they want to bring new vendors in to the government's industrial base, right? Both on the defense side, right? There's a whole slew of kind of new tech players who want to get in and have things to offer there. And also, I think on the civilian side, right, particularly like in the back office with respect to business systems, right, a number of providers out there who are doing interesting things, serving the commercial market, haven't necessarily got into the government market. I take a look, like, for example, at the government-wide credit card program that GSA runs, called the Smart Pay program, right, where there's been a bunch of RFI and demo activity that looks like it's at least designed to potentially bring some new players into that market. So anyways, I think a big push in this administration to use these techniques that make it much more attractive, make government business much more attractive for new entrants.
Great. And yes, definitely some of those things you mentioned, CISOs, OTAs, and even the rewrite of the FAR, hopefully lowers barriers and creates less cost and more focused on outcomes. So Matt, what are you seeing? I know you work in naval shipbuilding, et cetera, but how do you approach that from a PE perspective? I'm curious, and other ways as well.
Yeah, I think it's directly relevant here, right? So, first off, I think the lens that Simon put out there, right, which was around value, is what gets to it, right? So you combine value with disaggregation of of contracts, and then you can start to build a portfolio, right, of approaches from a procurement perspective around how are you trying to implement your policy, right, of building the industrial base to support shipbuilding in this country, right, which is going to be a significant challenge, right? We have some incumbent, tier one contractors, but there's a lot of elements within the supporting supply base that's not ready to ramp up to what we need it to ramp up to. So if I think about what we do within private equity, the best organizations don't think about this as a cost play. They think about it as a value play. And disaggregating or building suppliers is about creating capability, growth, and resilience, which gives them more value, right? So at the end of the day, they are saving money, but they're also creating capability by segmented thinking, right? Getting into a portfolio of, hey, this is what we're going to do with this sector, right? And how we're going to contract. Here are the choke points within the industry and how we're going to incent it through the contracting that we use there. Sometimes disaggregating and pulling it out, right, from those bigger contracts so we can focus like a laser, right on those and set the right kind of KPIs so that that can be built and we can give them the incentives to build the kind of capability we're going to need for the future. So that kind of thinking, I think, really plays into that whole space and absolutely can be done. It's not a trade-off, right? It is a way of creating more value.
Great, and I think there's a couple of great points in there. I'll come back to that, but Simon, what are
Yeah,
you seeing in the UK
just
and
to add to
beyond?
that, Raj, and there's a couple of interesting kind of examples from public sector around the rest of the world on this topic. So we do a lot of work in the Middle East. The Saudi government is trying to diversify the entire economy away from oil, and they have a concept they called local content. But local content is basically about understanding and tracking how much of the money spent by the Saudi government or Saudi organizations is actually retained within the kingdom. So it's a fascinating, huge countrywide project to look at how a supply chain grows and evolves over time. And it's been enormously successful, and it's been a way for them to translate the meaningful and significant power that their spend has to a policy objective of creating capacity within a country that didn't inherently have it. So it's a really interesting case study, and it's worked very well. In the UK, as part of our procurement law, there's a concept called social value. Social value, basically, without going into tons of detail, is a mandatory part of every public tender, and 10% of the scoring is attributed to social value. Now, there are a number of themes underneath social value, but one of those themes is about supporting and creating local economy. And again, you see lots of very interesting case studies of particularly local councils, as we would call them, perhaps state councils, as you would call them in the US. Again, using their significant buying power to real effect within the economy. And it's that 10%. So it's making the concept very meaningful and being very directive, but done well. And I think there are lots of examples. Absolutely, you can deliver better value and better outcomes and create an industrial base, bring in more innovative suppliers, create SMEs that didn't exist before. So it's a very exciting area, right?
Alan or anyone, please chime in as we proceed here. Any reaction to any of that? I have a couple of follow-ups, but please go ahead.
No, I think the examples from the global examples are really interesting, right? I mean, speaking for myself, we can get kind of so US focused, right, in your own market. You forget sometimes to kind of pick up your head and look at what's going on around the rest of the world and seeing it's not always directly applicable, right? But to Simon's point, right, there are some kind of interesting examples out there that could be applicable to what's going on in the US.
One of the things that strikes me about those comments, Simon, right, is sort of that greenfield view, right? That ability, those folks there are looking at industries with no legacy, right? And they're looking at it with a fresh sheet of paper, right? And so what can be learned, right, from taking that kind of view of, hey, we want a shipbuilding industry, right, that's built for scale, agility, and has innovation embedded in it, right? How are they thinking about that, right, when they look at it from a fresh sheet? That can help inform some of the things that we're trying to do, I think.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's particularly interesting about the Saudi example is how they've kind of measured it, right? So it's not an uncommon policy kind of outcome for lots of governments around the world to want to create industrial capacity or encourage SMEs. What's interesting about the Saudi example is how they've actually translated that into a kind of measurable data-led conversation, right? Because there's a danger it just becomes oh, we're going to do this, but actually recording it and being able to report back, like everything, if it's measured, it tends to get better, right? And I think what the Saudis government has done is been particularly impactful in that sense, right? Because they're now working off tangible data, not theoretical data.
Let me come back now, and the question of or the goal of strengthening, whether it's the vendor base, supplier base, industrial base, whatever you want to call it, is so critical to achieving overall kind of larger objectives, right? Around having kind of manufacturing capabilities and driving innovation. Those are really kind of overarching objectives. I'm wondering, do you see a clash between kind of the goal of reducing cost here and cutting costs and this goal of strengthening the industrial base?
I don't think personally. I don't see a clash, Roger. I think there are some complexities as you look at that. So we do a lot of work in defence in the UK, for example. It's interesting. So you can create industrial capacity, but there's always a danger with defence. The way it goes about doing that is effectively it goes to their prime contractors. It goes to the big organisations as the obvious way to try and achieve that. But that's, if you're not careful, what that does is that actually stymies the innovation, right? So it's the triangle of managing cost, encouraging innovation and SMEs, and the outcome. And it's absolutely achievable, but it's not easy, and it's a complicated thing. But where we see really exciting outcomes is actually from, particularly in defence, getting the SME community involved. That's where the real innovation lies, right? And that's really exciting. I think that's a huge opportunity, and that certainly presents a cost reduction opportunity. There's a danger from our perspective of defence that bigger is always better. Not necessarily, right? And you can definitely get more innovation at lower cost if you think differently about how you approach the market, and particularly if government gets out of the way a little bit, right? There is an overemphasis on the process, and it's not easy to do business, certainly with the UK government. They're getting better at taking some of those barriers down, but the more that those come down, I think the easier it will be for SMEs to engage in and genuinely bring innovation at reduced cost.
I think another angle on that too, is PE can sometimes be accused of being very short-term focused, right? And we talked about how there's a bias for action and impact, right? But they're also willing to invest, right? And they do make long-term investments either in companies or in the infrastructure and the assets that those companies have. And many of those are over 3-5 year time horizons, right? If we look often at what we're doing within government, we not only do we have this gold rush, right? Come September, we're often on an annual cycle, right? And we prevent that industrial base from being able to make the kinds of investments that are going to take costs down, increase capability, and drive more innovation over time, right? So I think there's some things we can learn there, and a trick or two, right, that we can pull in. I know that some of the regulations have been changed in that regard, but I don't think we've been taking advantage of it enough, particularly as it relates to exactly what you're talking about, which is really building that capability in focused areas inside of that supply chain. So I think we delayer it, right? Take that clean sheet approach, right? To looking at what are all the components, where the investment needs to be focused, and then drive the longer term commitments there, right? As opposed to at the big platform level, right? We may tend to do that for a Virginia class, submarine, right? Or for a destroyer, right? Not at the point where the investment necessarily might be needed to build that capability longer term. So I think these are things that we can learn.
Okay. To your original question, Raj, actually, I don't think if there's pressure to reduce cost, I don't necessarily think that sort of impacts innovate. I think it could impact it in a good way, right? And that if it's done properly, right? You forcing people, right, to really take a hard look at everything, right? To maybe to Matthew's point, take this clean sheet approach, right? Really kind of rethink the problem entirely you're trying to solve and how you might go about solving it. So I think that kind of pressure can be good, right? Can produce, good innovative results. I think you have to kind of do it and lead it in the right way, right? I mean, the fascinating thing going on in the federal government right now is, in addition to that pressure to reduce costs, one of the areas they're reducing costs in is personnel, right? So you're losing a ton of people, right? Some of which are very good people with a lot of knowledge who might be able to contribute to that effort, right? So the question is, and we're early in this kind of big change that's going on, at least at the U.S. federal level, but like, what does that impact from a people standpoint? If you lose a lot of good key people, what impact does that have on your ability to both manage that reduction in cost and also then come up with good innovative solutions? We'll see, right? I feel like we're in a big U.S. government's a big petri dish right now, and we're we're watching the experiment play out in real time, right? So we should do another one of these in like 6 or 9 months, right, to sort of see what some of the results have been.
At the speed at which things are moving, maybe in another month, and see kind of what else.
Right. I can't tell
I will say
we...
nobody can accuse anyone of not moving at speed here. So
Agreed.
one last question. I know there are a couple of questions here, and just I know we're coming up on that half hour that we said. I think Matt, you mentioned services. Any other areas that you see ripe for opportunity in applying some of these strategies that we've discussed or actions?
Yeah, well, certainly, services are, a big deal. It makes up probably 50% of what the spend is, right? So, I guess maybe that's good that, we see a lot of opportunity there. But outside of that, I think, we start to get into things like, hardware, IT hardware in particular, things around logistics and, warehousing, transportation. There's a fair amount of redundancy, right, that we will see, from a private equity perspective whenever we get into a company. And, we all know, right, that, there are, a degree of, redundant assets and, redundant, structures and organizations trying to do some of the same kinds of things that we try to harmonize, but, I don't know that it's all been, sort of brought to bear. And so it's an efficiency play, right, around things like logistics and transportation, but it can also become, a resilience play, right, for particularly in the defense sector, right, around how we manage, the assets that we have and the supplies that we have, in times of need and crisis, right? So I think it, represents, sort of both a cost optimization play, right, as well as a resilience play in those areas.
Well, Simon, really, we're up on that hour. So what do you suggest?
Yeah, the one I was going to add, cloud. Cloud's a great example. Certainly over here, UK government is terrible at buying cloud and cloud services. It's huge opportunities for efficiency there. That's partly about cooperating more. Often these things are done in silos by the big government departments, as we would have. And actually, if there was more collaboration certainly on things like cloud, there would be a massive opportunity to unlock that licensing, SaaS generally. With best one in the world to the UK government, there's opportunity in almost every area of spend, right? As there always will be, right? Governments are complicated complicated organizations doing complicated things, right? But there will always be opportunity there, right? It's not a bad thing.
Yeah, I would note one just super quickly, because I know we're a minute away from being done, but one example happening right now at the U.S. federal level, right, is this idea for some of the large enterprise software vendors, think Salesforce and Oracle and ServiceNow, right, some of those players. The General Services Administration has really kind of picked up the ball and said, hey, we want to negotiate on behalf of at least the entire federal civilian government, right, and try and cut a single deal for, some base level of services or products from those organizations. with committed spend and to do the contracting directly with them. Whereas, you know, in the past, the government's often gone through reseller channels, right? Which kind of creates a middleman in between the government and the OEM. So that's a pretty big change. Literally those discussions and negotiations are going on right now. And I would expect over the next few months, we'll see a series of announcements which talk about, you know, some of those direct deals that the government, US government has negotiated with some of the largest enterprise software companies in the world.
Great. So some great takeaways here. I know 30 minutes, I knew it was going to be a challenge here, but I think we still got a lot put in here. So thank you, everyone. If you would like to stick around, we'll stay on for a few more minutes and we'll answer a couple of the questions also. I know that came up, but we'll be following up with more on this topic as Alan suggested. And thank you to this great panel as well for joining. But we'll stick around if you have time. And if you'd like to come up, I say come up, I'm going back to the audio app days of like people coming up on stage. But if you'd like to, I can just invite you up if you're interested. We know there's a lot of people here with some great experience, and we'd love to hear. But so thank you, and this ends the official part of our webinar at the moment. Thank you. So we'll go ahead and pick up here. There are a couple of questions here. I believe Christina Bates asked about, you know, I think Alan, you brought up specifically, what do you recommend in terms of rethinking the skill sets of KOs, et cetera, to manage outcomes versus, you know, the risk-based or kind of cost-based approach that's potentially there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, right? Because if you're gonna, you know, if all of a sudden you're gonna come in and say, hey, we want to measure based on outcomes, right? It's, okay, that's great. Someone who's maybe done their whole career just, you know, kind of doing typical T&M contracts who thinks about inputs, right? You know, I want a certain number of hours and I want certain skill sets or people that have certain education levels, right? Those are all inputs. They're not, you know, they're not in any way, shape, or form tied to outputs, kind of a staff augmentation mindset. So if you know, to Matt's point, if the private equity buyer comes in and they all of a sudden go and say, great, we're going to, you know, focus on outputs here, right? Some of the procurement people might say, I don't actually know, kind of don't know how to do that, right? That's not how I'm trained. So I do think it would be important to kind of, to the extent you're going to keep those people and work with them, to kind of come with a little bit of a toolkit for them, right? To skill them up so that they can, you know, they can manage these agreements in an appropriate way, right? Because it's a good chance, certainly at the U.S. federal level, there's a good chance it's different than how they've been working in the past.
And Alan, I would just add, I think just based on my own personal experience, I think I've said, you know, based on all the regulations and policies and FAR, this is not how the private sector does it, right? And somehow they have the most incentive to get the best deal, right? And it's a profit motivation, right? Yet it's done very differently. So I think there's an opportunity to really bring in private sector practices. Some we're talking about right now, and Alan, you and I worked on, for instance, lotting strategies, right? Very basic approach, but a lot of times from a market discovery standpoint, we don't know what the price points are going to be and how, if we bundle it a certain way or if we don't, until you do the real discovery in real time and do lotting strategies. But we don't do some of these basic things, and we're still tied up. So I do believe there's a massive amount of retraining required on the acquisition workforce side. If we're really going to bring the federal government to kind of where I believe the best practices lie. Simon or Matt, any advice on kind of the workforce part of this?
I don't know. I have much to add. I mean, I'd agree with everything you and Alan just said, Raj. And Matt, I don't know if you...
Yeah, I think, you know, certainly, yeah, the nature of scaling right across procurement is changing pretty dramatically, right? You know, there's this you know, convergence of process and technology right around how we do procurement, how we you know, look at supply markets, how we investigate them, how we develop the kinds of KPIs that we're going to use, and then the tools and technology you just talked about, right? That, you know, we're going to establish sort of single vendor relationships on. The best organizations, right, are developing what they call these citizen developers, right? They're folks who are procurement people first, but technological and digital innovators second, right? And they really immerse themselves in how I can use these tools to fundamentally shift the way we're working, right? To get more efficiency, get to better measures, get to better outcomes, and increase the clock speed, right, of the things that we're doing with the supply base. So I think that's a real key thing for us to watch for and to invest in as we move this forward.
Great. No, totally agree. And I know Mike Carroll, great to have you up here. Mike, always have great advice, and I know you just made a comment, so I thought I'd just have you kind of share that with us.
Hey, yeah, thanks, Roger. And I think it nests very well with what we're talking about now on training. Matt said something earlier on in his first answer about metrics. And the government doesn't do a good job of designing metrics, right? And so if I were to say that the workforce needed training in one area, it would be designing metrics around the outcomes that truly, right now, our metrics are all about speed to get something on contract, right? And it has nothing to do with what's being delivered to us. And so I would encourage everybody to look at things like, Justin Finelli at the Navy in the CTO office has put out several things about aligning metrics to outcomes. And that's where I think we need to spend a lot of time in developing both the current workforce and probably a new subset of the workforce that focuses purely on that.
It's a really great point. And I think it starts with that, right? If we get those wrong up front, requirements, and then we have the wrong set of measures, then that's what you kind of, you measure, you get what you measure, right? Or whatever that saying is. So no, great point, Mike. But yeah, anyone else have any, and we'll wrap this up then. If anyone else has a comment or question, I'm looking at the Q&A here. If anyone else wants to come up, please go ahead, and then we'll wrap this up here. Anyone else? Any other comments?
Hey, Raj, while you're
Great.
waiting for folks to type, let me say just two more things. Particularly this year, more than any other year, I think it's important that we take politics out of what we're trying to do, right? It's okay whether you're politically leaning to one side or the other to say that the other side has a good idea, right? And to embrace that and find that good and exploit the good for everything that it's trying to do. I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the news cycle and think that the other side is the enemy, and that's not the case. Everybody wants to do the right things. And the last point I'll make, Raj, you said something earlier about defining or increasing the vendor base, right? I think we need to define what strengthening the vendor base means. More vendors doesn't always mean good vendors, right? And I think that goes back to the metrics comment. More can be better, but it doesn't have to be better. So I think as customers, the government customers start to move forward, we've got to figure out, do we really need more people doing it? If we have 500 companies doing something, more might not be the answer. So I just encourage everyone to think about how you look at those things.
So such a good point, and definitely, and also might be a category by category thing too. I think it depends where there's issues, right, in the supplier base, because that's not always the case. The services base, you could say, is potentially not as suffering as much, especially in certain areas like program management, acquisition support. There's probably a zillion companies that do the same thing, right? So Christina, I'll take the last comments here, and then we'll wrap up. You had some comments. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just touching on the KPI point. I think they're all very much related, and I think the point that was just made about it's not the quantity of vendors, it's the quality. I think that goes directly to the government having a far better understanding of what it is they're actually asking for when they begin to draft an RFI and certainly an RFP. And I think if the RFPs were drafted with language that more spoke specifically to desired outcomes, then you'd start to get a bit of sense of being able to parse out which vendors are actually capable and which vendors are not. They may be capable of other things, but not capable in that given pool for capabilities that RFP speaks to. And I think most of what I've seen in government, working up close with acquisition now for almost 20 years, I've seen many programs that have succeeded, and I've seen many that have failed after 10, 12 years and multi-million dollars spent, is that a big part of it is the government really never understood what it wanted from the get-go. It was more of I would call a lot of it theoretical, and then the vendor then has years to kind of work through, not even beta testing, but alpha is how I referred to it. Until they finally maybe produce something. And by the time they do, especially if it's in an area where there's cutting edge technology, the technology is woefully obsolete by then. And then the government struggles with how do we kill it? Because we know there's a better option out there. But this program has already entered into even low rate initial production. So I think KPIs, the education of SCOs, KOs, and cores, the better drafting of the RFPs and the government really having a mastery of what it is that they're really asking for from an output standpoint and not so much from an input standpoint. I think all of those things have to kind of be improved roughly in parallel in conjunction with the larger cultural problem. The biggest one I see is that you've probably all heard of it, the revolving door. And while I don't necessarily have a problem with that on a personal or professional level necessarily, but from a taxpayer standpoint, I think you have a lot of folks who end up in positions where they're somewhat compromised. And I don't mean that in a negative way or to denigrate, but they're compromised, right? Because they have certain loyalties. And sometimes those loyalties may align with what's best for the government, and sometimes they may not. And I know a lot of small businesses have run headlong into the wall that is really behind all of it, those loyalties. And so I'm hoping that with more emphasis on changing requirements and changing regulations, slowly, kind of in a reverse fashion, culture changes as well, which I think is probably going to be the biggest thing that needs to change at end of day. And so maybe we can get to that at minimum in a kind of reverse engineering fashion so that we get to best value in ways that really make sense in terms of best value regarding outputs and not necessarily inputs, which is really just, I think someone mentioned earlier, just a staff aug business model.
Great, Christina, thank you. And number of things I think you mentioned here. So I think with that, I'll go ahead and wrap this up, unless anyone on our panel has any final takeaways. But thank you so much. Does anyone have anything to add, or we can close this out? Okay. Well, thank you so much. Again, a lot more to discuss on this topic. Thank you so much for joining. And Simon, I know, thanks for joining from across the pond as well.
Thanks for having me, Raj. It's nice to be invited. So thank you.
Thank you. And so we'll be having more of these for sure, and we'll check back in. And thanks everyone for joining.